I'm Gary Lechliter, Kansas poet. I've been writing since about 1981, and I would like to read just 3 poems. One is from one of my favorite poets who's recently died, James Tate, who was a Kansas City resident, grew up and actually attended Pittsburgh State about 10 years before I did. Would love to have been there when he was there because he went on to Yale and won a lot of awards. He was one of my first influences in poetry. And he's now, of course, with that legion of the poets who have gone on. This, I think, is a defining poem for James Tate. This was the poem that defined him in his college years when he wrote the actual first book. When I began to write poetry, he had come out with a new book called Viper Jazz. But this is his most famous poem about his father. It's called The Lost Pilot. For my father, 1922-1944. Your face did not rot like the others. The co-pilot, for example. I saw him yesterday. His face is corn mush. His wife and daughter, the poor, ignorant people, stare as if he will compose soon. He was more wronged than Job. But your face did not rot like the others. It grew dark and hard like ebony. The features progressed in their distinction. If I could cajole you to come back for an evening down from your compulsive orbiting, I would touch you, read your face as Dallas, your hoodlum gunner, now, with the blistered eyes, reads the Braille editions. I would touch your face as a disinterested scholar touches an original page. However frightening, I would discover you, and I would not turn you in. I would not make you face your wife or Dallas or the co-pilot, Jim. You could return to your crazy orbiting, and I would not try to fully understand what it means to you. All I know is this: when I see you, as I have seen you at least once every year of my life, spin across the wilds of the sky like a tiny African god, I feel dead. I feel as if I were the residue of a stranger's life, that I should pursue you. My head cocked toward the sky, I cannot get off the ground. And you, passing over again, fast, perfect, and unwilling to tell me that you are doing well, or that it was a mistake that placed you in this world, and me in this, or that misfortune placed these worlds in us. This is my new book, Off the Beaten Path, published by Woodley Press. And since I am calling Neodesha, I guess, my hometown, that's where I grew up, as we talk about it. This is actually a poem about Neodesha, or about the river. This is called The Water is Smoky with Mud, which is a translation from the Osage language for Neodesha. And I know the water, the rocks and moss, downstream the bend and adjacent riffles, the smell of familiar ash on the riprap, above the dam, farm fields and hedge. The river is smoky with mud and memory of the girl who barely knew me, said she could never love me, and nearly gave herself on the cut bank but held on to Christ. Faith's inhibition nearly smoked. I held her quietly, moved with guilt, tossed to the water the condom I bought for 25 cents from the vending machine at Bob's Texaco. The water, transient, muddy and fogged, swirled darkly past knots of driftwood, the knee joints of old trees, rooted and firm, the girl in her soiled half-slip, shuddering. And this is a new poem that I wrote after my daughter stayed with us a few days, helped us kind of get our house in order. The things we gave to Goodwill. Our history went out the door. The Christmas ornaments we treasured but no longer need will hang on different trees. Clothing we cannot wear now. The business suits and a few ties, an overcoat shouldered in dust, shoes worn at the heels, all the articles of our working lives. Some toys the grandkids have outgrown, the ones that work, will sit on the shelves where kids grab them and love them until they've grown stale. Books by the dozen, fiction, paperbacks, murder mysteries, travel guides to where we've been, magazines, reference guides, old books of poetry to be read or tossed like offal to the recycling bins. Some things we nearly kept because they hold memory. The horse blanket we huddled in that winter we watched the eagles perch at the lake. The china and objects of glass that were new when our dining room table was new. The ceramic desk lamp that assuaged our aging eyes. In this we give ourselves away, shared biographies, stories simple things tell, the struggle of what we know through years of endeavor and what we become. Well, my original study was psychology, and I was an undergraduate at Pittsburgh State University, very fine university, in 1981, and my advisor told me, well, you need some more English. And so we had a resident poet at the time, Dr. Michael Heffernan. So I went there thinking, well, this will be an easy A. And he read to us from James Tate's Viper Jazz. And I was transfixed by the way that not only James Tate, but other poets that we read in class put words together in the ways simplest and in so few words could say so much. So as I began to write class assignments, Dr. Hefferson kind of took me aside when I said, I think even though your training is in psychology, you should continue writing because you may be published one day. And he was right, I was. And that's how I got started. I would, of course, do all my psychology assignments, and then when I had a little free time, I would write something, The first stuff I wrote were awful. The first poems I wrote were trash. But I've kept them, just to look back and see where I've come along the journey. That would have been 1981, so I was 30. James Tate, of course, has recently passed. William Stafford, our own Kansas poet, a great, great poet. James Wright, who was a Buddhist poet. Billy Collins, alive with us today. Chase Twitchell, who is a wonderful poet. Mary Oliver. And I would encourage young writers when they're starting out to write to pick some of the most recent Mary Oliver books and see the way she just lays down her message and writes with such grace and in so few words says so much. Stephen Dunn, I have just about all his books. Karen Merriam Goldberg, who was our third Kansas Poet Laureate. Yusuf Komanyaka, a Vietnam veteran poet. Denise Lowe, who was our second Kansas Poet Laureate. Charles Simic, an immigrant as a child from one of the Slavic nations. He's just very clever, and these little tiny poems that he'll write of 10 or 12 lines, he can say so much in the world of creatures and ideas that we don't live in. So Charles Simic is one of those, and Robert Lowell, who wrote one of my favorite poems, Skunk Hour. And Eric McHenry, who is now our current Kansas Poet Laureate, and our current National Poet Laureate is Juan Felipe Herrera, and I have read some of his work too. As you can see, if you see my poems, I write in stanzas. That's just how my poems come out. One or two poems I've written are just one single stanza, but normally I write stanzas, 6 or 7 lines or 5 sometimes. Sometimes the amount of lines in a stanza varies. And then I may have a poem that's a page and a half. But then I go back and revise it, start cutting out the fat, cutting out those things that don't belong there, and it may come down to a half page by the time I'm finished. So I do a lot of revision to poems. I have little epiphanies, which is one of those times when you feel like you're one with the earth, or one with the universe. Like this poem about the things we gave to Goodwill after my daughter left, and I sat down, and it was just kind of a sudden little epiphany that, we gave so much of our life away, so many things that had been with us for so long. And so sometimes it just is something that has happened to me in life, or something I've read about, that just seems to want to come out. And sometimes I have written poems actually from a title, built a poem from a title. I decided to do several poems based on old Baptist hymns and other Baptist and others, from just the title of the hymn. And then they're not religious, but they're based on like Standing on the Promises, or some of those old standard hymns, because these were people who wrote a lot of these hymns, and they put a lot of their lives into them. But I'll take just the title of the hymn and write something totally unrelated, so that it's not religious. I'm kind of a rebel, I kind of like to write about things on the outside edge. Sometimes the poems are a little political. I write about nature, about how we abuse nature, about those things that we do that have been destructive to nature. I write a lot about birds, about extinctions of birds. And I want people to stop and think when they read one of my poems, whether they like it or not, that's irrelevant. But maybe it'll kind of make them think, yeah, you're right, we are kind of abusive creatures, we do terrible things. And then I write poems, about how all the good things that we do, and those things that are beautiful in nature. But a lot of my poems are based on nature. Being a weirdo. I wrote a poem recently, which I didn't bring, based on an episode last summer when I was driving in Lawrence. We pulled up to a stoplight, and a young man in a jacked up pickup truck sitting next to me looked down and spit through his skull and said, "You old weirdo." And I'm in my 60s, folks. I didn't want to, stop and make a big scene with this young man. But then as he drove off, there was a bumper sticker on his bumper that said, "Jesus is the answer," And I thought, well, what's the question? Yeah. So I have moments like that, when I feel like I am one of those outsiders. One of those people that has discovered who I am. And that I belong in the group of people, other poets that I enjoy being with. But I'm not mainstream. I'm one of those outsiders. There are different ways. Sometimes the poem, like I might have a title, and then the title is actually part of the first sentence in the poem. So I will just continue from that title, or I will just simply let it come out, sit down and just start writing, and from that begin to build the next line and the line after that. I write a lot of form poems. I enjoy sestinas. I've written several sestinas, a few villanelles, which is a French form poem, and a few pantoums, and those are form poems that require you to follow a certain pattern. And those are always challenging to me. So with a sestina, I have to think, what are these 6 words that I'm going to have to use at the end of these 6 lines in all these stanzas clear to the bottom in different order? So there's a challenge there to me, what 6 words am I going to use and how do I use them? And so I enjoy writing sestinas and villanelles and the old form poems from, thousands of years ago. Well, poetry to me is an art. I have no other way of expressing myself. I'm left-handed. I never learned really to do artwork. I really admire those people who are the great painters and designers, musicians. But to me, poetry is the art of the people. Whether you look at the graffiti scrawled on a wall as some original thing that somebody has said, that's still their word, that's still their art, that's still them putting their 2 cents in to all that's written in this world. So I look at poetry as an art, and I get to be, in my own thinking, one of the artists of this great state of Kansas, as a poet. And I like to think that it's important for a poet when you're writing is that you show people. You don't tell them. You show them. And you show them your message, as it's always been said, by writing it in as few words as possible, but saying the most in as few words as possible. My first book, which was Under the Full Moon, was still considered by some people to be my best book. And it was some of the earlier poems that I wrote as I kind of continued my journey to where I am now. So to just kind of come up with the poems that were previously published in journals around the nation and in England, and putting those together in this collection and seeing that other people actually read them and enjoy them. I'm not James Tate, but I do enjoy knowing that people find my poems. Some of them are amusing. I do write some that are funny. But they do sit and think about them sometimes. They don't just forget about it. That it's so minimal that it's forgettable. And that's what brings me the sense of creation, is that I put something together. It's a project. I've created a book of poetry. There have been many. Certainly my first poem that I published in a major journal, Rattle, published in California, excuse me, which is in, actually it was not put in the first book, but in the third book, Wind Dancing Across the Prairie. And I was just kind of developing my style and sent this off to Rattle in Van Nuys, California. And the editor at that time sat back and I said, "Oh, this is such a nice description of kind of who you are. You're this kind of cosmic cowboy who rides the jet stream and does these things." So I've always been very proud of that poem because it was my first major publication. I would say, be yourself. If you're writing, write as you talk. Don't try to over-influence people that you're this brilliant genius, and use superfluous words. Write as you talk. That's the best way to write. And I think one of the best examples of that in the most recent series of books about Harry Potter was J.K. Rowling. And that she was able to write into this nice, fresh, kind of small language that was maybe intended for kids, but us adults enjoyed those books very much. But it was very simple writing, just kind of the way you talk. Mm-hmm. And nobody got lost in fancy words. Nobody had to go look something up. It was very neat, and that's the way poetry should always be written. If you have a PhD in English, then you might use more superfluous words. But it always should be who you are. You should be yourself. When I was going through rehabilitation for a head injury a few years back, one of the therapists came in and had heard that I was a poet. And she was one of these anti-poetry people. And she came into the room and twirled her skirt and said, "Mr. Lechliter, poetry is dying." I let her labor in that and said, "Well, everybody has their own feelings about that." Why poetry is important is that it's the chronicle of who we are as people, of what we think, what we know, what we've learned, what we've endured. You look at the tragedy of some of the great poets, Sylvia Plath, for example, and the tragic life that she lived, but yet her poetry was so magnificent in describing her pain and her loss. Anne Sexton, who suffered some mental illness, and the gritting reality of her pain. And poets like Billy Collins, who use little clever tricks while he's writing. His poetry is very simple, but I always am taken by the little tricks that he uses to trick the reader into different things. And so I think that it's so very important that poetry continues. It's been around for thousands of years. The book read by millions of people every year on Sunday. The Holy Bible has both prose and poetry in it. Some of it is beautiful, some of it is about various different aspects of human life, murder, incest, pillagery, war. But these are all things that are important to us. This is how we became who we are. And so I think it's important that poetry continues to tell people, this is who I am, this is how I see the world. I kind of write like I talk. I don't try to impress with words that I have no meaning, that I have no idea what it means. I mean, that's going to look stupid if someone says, well, what did that word mean? Why do you, and you know, I try to keep psychology out of it, because psychology, when I write, as I wrote reports, and even at the VA where I worked for 22 years, you had to have a different language. You had to use more clinical type of prose that we know. And in psychology, you write. It's a different language. It's scientific. Poetry has a language all its own. It's the use of metaphor. It's the use of simile. It's the use of angels. It's the use of elves, of ghosts, and these things that science says don't exist, but you can still put them in poems. Because you pick on an angel, or you pick on a ghost, or you talk about the gods, or something like this, and these are important uses of these characters that a lot of people put in their poems, because a ghost is someone to pick on. They don't exist, but you can still use them. Angels, I've used angels in a lot of my poems because we don't know that they exist, but I still pick on them. Or I talk about how I was in love with one, or how one was my imaginary sister who died at birth, which I've written several poems about. Or how an angel kind of walked through our house at one night, you know, and I'm using it to illustrate some other point. Or when several of us in an imaginary poem camped out in the Stoll Cemetery at night, you know, supposed to be the most haunted place in America. And all the images that came to mind when I'm thinking about several of my poet friends and I are camping in this horrible place, and all the images of Revelation and all those things in there, you know. So it's important that we have this language of its own. And it's fun, really. Poems are fun to write because you can pick on ghosts, and you can pick on somebody from history that can't come back and sue you now because they don't exist anymore. I enjoy the Midwest. I'm not too crazy about winter, but I started out writing a lot of poems about rural scenes. And sometimes, as I used to drive to work from Lawrence to Topeka, I would pass a farm that seemed to have something particularly wonderful about that farm as I passed it, you know, that day, and I would begin to write that poem in my head. And then maybe, you know, when I was at work during a break, I would kind of reach over and do a little writing, you know, during my break and during my lunch break, carrying that image from that little farm that I just passed. Maybe the peonies had bloomed, or the irises by the side of the road had bloomed, or perhaps 3 deer had just crossed the road. So those are like those little epiphanies that cause me to write something. And so a lot of my poems have been published are kind of a rural or small town flavor. I've not written any poems about Kansas City when we lived there, or even Lawrence. Lawrence is about 90,000. But kind of like that, honoring kind of that small town life that I lived as a child in Neodesha. You know, small town. I had friends who were farmers, and the whole sense of these are the people that drive our world. We can't get by without them. And when I see an old red or an old dilapidated barn that had once been red and it's about ready to fall, I kind of imagine the family that lived there, who they were. Maybe I make up this whole family that lived where this old barn was. the silo with the tree growing out the middle, you know. Who lived there? What were their lives? What did they do? What did the ghosts that hang around there know when you walk that land at night? So the Midwest has been important to a lot of the poems that I write because that's where I grew up. Start out small. Don't over-exert yourself. Don't think, oh, I want to be published right away. Just take your time. Develop your style. If you're a poet who tends to write in stanzas, as I do, then develop that style. Most poetry today is free verse. There is still one of the greatest rhyming poets in our country, Richard Wilbur, still with us, has not perished, I don't believe. And his poems were rhyming so subtle that they almost seem like free verse when you read them. The rhyme is that subtle. It is all right to rhyme poems. It is all right to write rhyming poems as long as they are not sing-songy, iambic pentameter, reminiscent of the old poems that we read when we were in grade school. Rhyme is important if you know how to use it. If, when it is read, it is not rhymey, slimy, obvious rhyme, but it's used as slant rhyme or off rhyme. Mostly people write free verse because you can break the rules with free verse. You don't have to rhyme. You know, except now with villanelles, a lot of people usually rhyme with villanelles, but I've written some free verse villanelles. So it's important to just kind of start out slow. Start writing a few poems about things that are important to you. Have an epiphany. And then write something, and then maybe pass it along to somebody else. Pass it to a professor, or pass it to a friend whose work you admire. Take a look at this, what do you think? Tell them to be brutal. Be brutal. Tear it to smithereens. Be brutal. I need to learn. I need to know what I'm doing wrong and what I can do right. And then as you kind of get along to where you're saying, well, that's not good, and that's not me. Finally, you develop the voice that is you. And so when someone reads, they say, that's a Gary Lechliter poem, I can recognize that. Another person can say, that's a Billy Collins poem. I recognize that style. I recognize Sylvia Plath. I recognize Robert Lowell when I read it. You've read so, and I would encourage you to read the great poets. You're not going to read them and then try to emulate them or try to be like them, but you'll learn a lot of how they wrote. You'll learn a lot of little tricks that they used and all of the ways that they were able to express themselves, so that when you read one of their really great poems, you sit there and say, whew, that's great. That is great art. That is a great poem. And I would say that what we do nowadays in poetry is when you're coming to the end of the poem, you don't have a slam bang finish. You kind of let it just taper off. You kind of just let it end. So that's, I think, important for you to understand if you're starting out. Just write a few lines, write a few poems. Take a look at them, compare them to the work of somebody you admire. Look at the two of them and say, why are they so much better? And then you kind of learn some of the little things we do as poets, the little tricks that we use, the devices, the similes, the metaphors. When something is like something else, or something is something else. Love is like a rose is a simile. Love is a rose is a metaphor. So that you're learning to know those things and to use the language of poetry. And it's important also that you learn how to read a poem. That I've heard some of the best poets of my generation write wonderful poems, and they read them like they're reading a lab manual. Learn how to read a poem, and then when you read it, how to read it aloud. Like I did with the James Tate poem. You know, how that poem moves me as I read it. So it's important that you learn how to write your poems, but then if you're called to read some of your poems, you don't get up like this and talk about, and then you read it like you're reading something. People don't want to hear that. They want to hear what you've written. So it's important that you also learn how to read that poem so that it really comes out as you intended it to be.